Seidenberg versus Summit Bank. So Summit buys the plaintiff's companies, and in that deal is that they're going to work with him, but then they refuse to work with him after agreeing to, right? And the court says there's no need for an unequal bargaining power to bring about a claim of bad faith, and this is a bad faith question here, right? And that the parole evidence rule cannot apply to a good faith question because good faith is about the expectation of the parties in many cases. And so, if you want to redress bad faith, or if you want to inquire into the discretion of the contract, or impose terms that are implied by the contract but not clear, you need parole evidence, right? So, for example, right, the idea that they're going to work with them to the best of their abilities, how much was that talked about, right? Say I sign this big contract. Say I don't know, a Hall of Fame tier first baseman about to sign a 10-year contract with the Angels, and I say, well, I'm Albert Pujols, and I'm really hammering home that I want a 10-year personal services contract. And the Angels will say, fine, sure, whatever. We'll give you $1 million extra, or whatever the number is, $1 million a year. They don't care. And that's actually what happened, right? The personal services contract tacked onto the end of his 10-year deal because he wants to be a coach. Say we get to the end of the 10-year deal, and the clear purpose of that contract was that Albert wanted a chance at being a coach. And Albert says, I don't really want to be a coach anymore. And I'll forgo the $1 million. The Angels trying to enforce that, and it comes out, well, they didn't even want that term, and, they're just doing it because they feel slighted by the fact that Albert sucked for 10 years and they just want to force him to be a coach. Obviously, you're not going to push for specific performance, and this isn't a great analogy. I just like to talk about baseball. But essentially, right, the absent term there was that the personal service contract was for Albert, not for the Angels. So, he probably should have said, hey, I want this to be an option for me to have a 10-year personal services contract. But he didn't do that. But that's kind of an implied term there. Now, I don't think the court would actually rule that particular way, but that's a good example of what an implied term might be. That this is for you, or that, it's implied that we're going to help you out. Or in the personal services contract, it's implied that he gets a chance to be a coach. If they're just rolling out there to be an announcer, that's not what he wants. He wants a chance to coach. He doesn't care where. Send him down to the Dominican League. That's where he wants to coach. I mean, that's not where he wants to coach. He probably wants to coach in the majors. I don't know if I trust Albert Pujols to coach the majors for a bunch of reasons, but yeah, he wants to, and that's what they're doing with him. I believe they're sending him down to the Dominican League to coach, and I think he's going to do pretty well down there for a lot of different reasons. And hopefully he ends up getting back up. I like Albert Pujols. I didn't like his contract with the Angels, but anyway, that's enough about baseball. So back to the contract at hand, right? So you'd bring in that parole evidence to say, I was talking about being a coach. It's obvious I was talking about being a coach. They're acting in a bad faith by saying I should be an announcer instead, right? So, to consider what is good faith, the parties need to be allowed to state their expectations. What the expectations of the parties are really matter. So if you're doing something that's ridiculous, but it's also within the line of my expectations, then it's not really bad faith. And so first, the covenant permits the inclusion of terms and conditions that have not been expressly set forth in the written contract. This acts in instances to include terms that the parties must have intended because they are necessary to give efficacy to the contract, right? So again, Albert Pujols' personal services contract. That doesn't mean he shows up for one, big event a year. That means he wants to be a coach. You're not paying him $1 million to show up to that signing. You're paying him $1 million because he wants to be a coach. Is that a lot of money to pay for a coach? Yeah. But also, it was Albert Pujols, and you really wanted him to play for your team. That ended up going terribly. God. The Angels sucked at contracts for a couple years. I don't know who was advising them. It wasn't me. Second, the contracts, they're utilized to allow redress for bad faith performance of an agreement, even when the defendant hasn't breached an express term. Right, again, it wasn't expressed that Albert was going to be a coach. It might have been, I don't know. But that's what he wants. That's what he's there for. Contracts they permit inquiry into a party's exercise of discretion granted by the contract's terms. So back to this whole actual case we're dealing with. They had the discretion to act in improving in creating this relationship. But they had to actually create the relationship. They didn't create the relationship. Good faith would have, at least involved some faffing about. They didn't faff. They were like, oh, fuck off. Go away. We don't care about you. That'd be like if the Angels, they said, all right, Albert Pujols, for your personal services contract, we want you to scrub a toilet. Or just not calling him up. It's ridiculous. No, that's bad faith. That's not what a contract's about, right? Anyway, enough about Albert Pujols, enough about this case.